All right, before we begin, let's settle in. As we enter into the word, we begin the same way that we always do, with posture. Not to rush through it, not to prove anything, not to come in assuming that we already understand, but to be shaped by what we're reading. As usual, I'm using the King James Version. And remember, we're not just reading. We're using the Quarry framework, which is available in the shop on my website, which is facetsbygem.com. This means we're not skimming the surface. We're digging. So as you read, pull from the text. What is being said? What is being shown? What is being established? And what is being required in response? Pay attention to who is speaking, who is being spoken to, what is happening during this time, and why is it being said here? Don't look for just what sounds familiar, but what is actually being revealed. This week, you're about to read Job 25 through 42, Psalm 19 and 29, and Exodus 1 through 4. Different books, different moments, but one continuous revelation. As you go into this week's reading, I want you to watch for something very specific. Not just what God does, but how God reveals himself. Because before God changes the situation, he establishes who he is within it. If I had to give this week one title, it would be this: He speaks, he sees, he comes down. Because what you're about to see is not silence. It's a God who answers, a God who is aware, a God who moves. Let's prepare the ground. As you begin reading in Job 25 through 37, pay attention to what is happening. Because this section is not empty. It is full of voices, and every voice is attempting to define God without fully understanding him. In Job 25, the tone is established. Behold, even the moon, and it shineth not. Yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. God's standard is immediately set beyond creation. So the question becomes, if even the stars are not pure, where does that leave man? Then in Job 27, Job makes a firm declaration. Till I die, I will not remove mine integrity from me. This matters, because while others are trying to explain his suffering, Job is holding his position. And not in pride, but in conviction. Then in Job 28, we hit the question that shifts everything. Where shall wisdom be found? Man can dig into the earth, extract resources, search deeply, but still not find wisdom. And then the answer is given. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding. So wisdom is not something you discover on your own. It is something rooted in reverence toward God. Then in Job 29, Job reflects on what once was. My root was spread out by the waters. My glory was fresh in me. He remembers favor, strength, clarity. But by Job 30, everything has shifted. They had me in derision. My soul is poured out. Now we see affliction, loss, humbling. So we're watching the contrast between former blessing and present suffering. Then in Job 31, Job walks through his integrity in detail. Let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. And even if I rejoiced at the destruction of him that hated me, he didn't. So Job is not claiming perfection, but he is making something clear. His suffering does not align with the accusations being placed on him. Then in Job 32, Elihu enters, and he shifts the tone. Great men are not always wise, and there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. So now the conversation moves from assumption to claimed insight. In Job 33, Elihu introduces something deeper. He keepeth back his soul from the pit, that God can use correction not to destroy, but to preserve. Then in Job 34, He reinforces, for his eyes are upon the ways of man. God sees everything. Nothing escapes him. And this line in Job 36 is critical. He openeth also their ear to discipline, and commandeth that they return from iniquity. God doesn't just act. He instructs. He corrects. He calls people back. And then, if they obey and serve him, they shall spend their days in prosperity. But if they obey not, they shall perish. So now obedience becomes the dividing line. And in Job 37, it all builds to this. God thundereth marvelously with his voice, which prepares us for what comes next. Because when God speaks, it will not be quiet. So as you read through Job 25 to 37, understand what is happening. Man is speaking. Man is reasoning. Man is trying to interpret God. But no one has settled anything. And then God answers. As you begin Job 38, pay attention to how God enters the conversation. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, not gently, not passively, but with authority. And instead of explaining Job's suffering, God begins asking questions. Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts? That question alone shifts everything, because God is addressing the source of understanding, not Job's situation, but Job's position. Then he continues, Canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds? Canst thou send lightnings? These are not questions about knowledge. They're questions about control. As you read, understand what God is doing. He's dismantling the illusion that man governs anything. Then moving through Job 38 into 39, God walks through creation. Wilt thou hunt thy prey for the lion? Who provideth for the raven his food? God is not just creator, he's sustainer. Everything that continues because he maintains it. And then in Job 39, it says, Knowest thou the time when the wild goats bring forth? Hast thou given the horse strength? Doth the eagle mount up at thy command? It's timing, strength, elevation, all assigned, but none self-produced. Then in Job 41, Leviathan is introduced. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook? Something man cannot control. He cannot subdue it. He can't even approach it. And then God says, Who then is able to stand before me? If man cannot stand before what God created, he cannot stand in judgment of God. And then this line, Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine. God is establishing ownership, authority, sovereignty. Before anything is resolved, God establishes who he is. Now watch what happens in Job 42. It says, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. This is the shift from information to revelation. Job didn't gain new circumstances yet. He gained new sight. And the response was, Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. When God is seen correctly, self is no longer defended. It's humbled. Then the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. God restores, not because Job demanded it, but because God is not only powerful, he is just. Now we move into Psalm 29, and I want you to notice the repetition. The voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars. The voice of the Lord shaketh the wilderness. This is not poetic filler. This is emphasis. When God speaks, things move. Things break. Things shift. Things respond. And then in Psalm 19, It builds on that. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. Now we move from his voice in creation to his word in instruction. The testimony of the Lord is sure. The statutes of the Lord are right. The commandment of the Lord is pure. The judgments of the Lord are true. What God says is not partial. It's complete. It's reliable. It's righteous altogether. And the response? Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart. After hearing God clearly, alignment becomes internal, not just behavior, but heart. Now we enter into Exodus 1, and everything shifts into reality. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage. This is affliction, pressure, oppression. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied. Affliction did not stop what God established. It revealed it. Then in Exodus 2, they cried. And now we see God's response unfold in layers. God heard, God remembered, God looked, God had respect. Nothing is overlooked. Nothing is missed. God is fully aware. Now in Exodus 3, God speaks. It says, I have surely seen the affliction and have heard their cry, for I know their sorrows. God is not learning. He already knows. And I am come down to deliver them. This is the turning point. God does not remain distant from suffering. He enters into it. And then Moses responds, who am I? Seeking identity. They will not believe me. He's fearful. I am slow of speech. Insecurity shows up. And God answers with one thing. Certainly I will be with thee. It's not about ability. It's his presence. And then I am that I am. God does not become what is needed. He already is. As you go into this week's reading, here's what I want you to watch for. Authority. God establishes who he is. Revelation. Seeing changes response. Voice. When God speaks, things move. Awareness. God sees, hears, and remembers. Movement. God comes down to deliver. And then presence. I will be with thee. Job shows us his authority. Psalms shows us his voice. And Exodus shows us his movement. And maybe this week, this is your word. Presence. I will be with thee. He doesn't leave in questioning. He doesn't leave in affliction. He doesn't leave in calling. He comes down. He speaks. He delivers. This is the Quarry. We begin with posture. We build on truth. And we allow the word to shape us. Foundation, formation, and placement. I'll see you next week.